Okay, so the recording has started. If people could put their names in the chat as a record of attendance. And today we have Jill, who was talking to us. I know again on the invite, it said Amanda, but in the body it did say Jill. But Jill is talking about end of life rituals. So I'm going to hand you over to Jill. Okay.
Super. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for coming, and thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts about how we as a society
I think
say
it did
goodbye.
go, Lisa.
I'll keep going, just let me know if I ought to stop. I wanted to start by just explaining where I come in at this from. I am a chaplain here at Phyllis Tuckwell, and as such, I'm also a Christian minister ordained by the Christian Church. But my interest in this is more broad. In other words, I'm not here to tell you all to have a Christian funeral or even any of our patients. Years ago, I did research into contemporary rituals and rites of passage. And so my interest comes from that side rather than exclusively a Christian perspective. And actually the prompt to explore this came over the summer from 3 different encounters with relatives of patients who had been under our care. And in all of those 3 encounters, there was one common theme, and it was the recent rise in the number of people who are using direct cremation services. If I just explain that direct cremation is an unattended cremation with no funeral service or ceremony. So the body is cremated, but no mourners are present, and then the ashes are returned to the next of kin if they request it, and with some if you pay for it. So it's important for us all to remember that different companies offer different levels of service. It's an issue I'll come back to, but when I'm talking about direct cremation, I'm talking about the general practice, not specific specific companies. I think there's a number of reasons why direct cremations has become increasingly popular. The most obvious is that it's cheaper. It is seen by a lot of people as simpler. Social attitudes are obviously changing. Some people reject what they see as old traditions or the idea that funerals are religious. And a lot of people talk about traditional funerals being impersonal. I've also heard patients talking about wanting to not be a burden to their families, and the idea that if they prepay and if they've taken the idea of having to hold a funeral off the to-do list for families, then they're doing them a favour. I want to say at this stage that I'm not advocating any particular position, as I said a moment ago. I know that it's not our place to influence anyone, and I know that our work isn't directly affected, but what we do is related to what happens to the body and what happens to the relatives after patients have been in our care. And I think this is particularly relevant, I think, for counsellors, which I'll touch on later, and for those of you involved in advanced care planning. I think it's better for us to be informed and to be aware of the implications. So if I just start by sharing a little bit of those 3 stories that prompted me to think that it might be a good idea for us to think about this for a while. They were all within a couple of weeks over the summer, and the first was on the inpatient unit. I'd arrived early one morning, and one of the nurses was concerned that a patient had died overnight. There was a long waiting list of patients needing a bed on the inpatient unit. And because we're only 10 beds at the moment, there's pressure on trying to get the room cleaned before a new patient arrives with us. Now, the patient had died overnight, but the relative had just suddenly had this idea that he'd really like to have a thumbprint of the deceased, and was waiting for an Amazon package to help him to create a thumbprint, which he could then make into jewellery. And the concern was that the deceased was going from our care into a direct cremation service, and that the family would have no access to the patient, to the body, after it left our care. So that was the first one. The second was the wife of a patient who died in our care a couple of years ago. The wife had been supporting a daughter with learning difficulties, and I think that the counsellors would describe what she was going through as delayed grief. In other words, her whole focus had been trying to support her daughter, and therefore her own grief had not really had time to be processed. And so two-ish years on, she had reached out to the hospice again and asked for some help. And so I went to visit her at home. And one of the things that came up in her distress was that a few months before we met, her sister-in-law had died. Her sister-in-law she got on well with. They'd had, I think, monthly phone calls just to see how each other were doing. And the brother-in-law had phoned to say she's died unexpectedly, and we're having a direct cremation, and there will be no event, no funeral. And what had happened to the woman that I was speaking to was that she couldn't quite believe it had happened, because she had no proof that it had happened. She hadn't attended an event. And I think we often hear people talking about the way that grief can play tricks on you, that you can imagine that that person's still there, and then you need to remind yourself, and that perhaps the power of a ritual, the power of being with other people and saying goodbye, might have helped her in her processing of that grief. So there was the thumbprint, the relative who hadn't had a funeral, and then the third one was again on the inpatient unit. It was a woman with a brain tumour who came to us for about 6 weeks, and on admission to the inpatient unit had said that she didn't want any of her family to visit once she had arrived at the hospice. So I'd got involved because Dr. Amanda had invited me to see if I could explore that a bit more with the patient. I got very involved in supporting the husband and by proxy the family, because she never changed her mind. And the family was a small, close family, but it included a 21-year-old son and a mum who was very close to the patient in our care. And it was during those conversations with the husband that I discovered that not only were the family not able to see her for the last 6 weeks of her life, but that husband and patient had agreed that she would have a direct cremation, and that they wouldn't be doing any joint event with the family to say goodbye. So those are the three stories that I was involved with, and prompted me to want for us to think about this. And I suppose it's prompted, when I've been reflecting on it, I've realised that it's my belief that what we call a funeral is more than the disposal of a body. And so that for the next hour, I want us just to explore that a little bit. And before I go on...
Jill, could I interrupt?
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone else has got the same view as we've got. We can only see your title page.
Yes, I'm about to change it.
That's fine.
Is that all right? You don't need to see me, do you? Or... Okay, I'll keep going.
I think people were worried that you meant to have been moving on and we weren't saying.
Yes.
But
No. Okay, thank you. Before I go on, I know this is an emotive topic. Most of us have our own experiences and views. I'll try and stick to the facts, and then hopefully at the end we'll have a little bit of time for comments, questions and stories at the end. So to move on to my next slide, I hope. Just to give you a map of what I want to look at, I want to start with a bit of background, looking at what rites of passage are all about. I want to explore what end-of-life rituals are for. We need to touch on different faiths and cultures. Looking at the fact that our customs change, it would be wrong to think that funerals have always been the same, because they haven't, and the fact that things are changing now isn't anything new. And then just a personal reflection at the end before we open it up for comments. So to begin with, rites of passage. Just to give you some background, in 1909, a man called Arnold van Gennep coined the phrase rites of passage. And in using it, he was describing the rites which accompany every change of place, state, social position and age. In other words, he looked at some of the major life transitions that we go through, such as birth, puberty, marriage and death. And he studied the rituals that we as human beings have developed to accompany them. Through his research of many different traditions and cultures around the world, he showed that all rites of passage, birth, marriage, death, puberty, all of them have similarities. And in both the transition and in the ritual, there are three phases: the phase of separation, of margin, and of reincorporation. And he likened those three phases to going through a doorway from one room to another, from one state to another. So he talked about before the threshold, on the threshold, and after the threshold. So on the threshold, that's the separation phase, when we are leaving or becoming detached from the group that we've been part of for a long time, perhaps. And then the margin phase is when we're going from one to the other. We're on the threshold between worlds or between phases. And then the third phase is called reincorporation. We become incorporated into a new group. If you carry on the analogy of the threshold, we're in the next room, the other room. In the West, we've actually lost a lot of our rituals, but these different stages are reflected in our language. The research I did was looking at motherhood as a rite of passage, and biological motherhood in particular. And if you think about the language that we have around that, you have a woman becoming pregnant, so that separation phase when she's called a pregnant woman. Then in terms of our language, you've got labour, and that's the margin phase. And then the reincorporation, she becomes a mother, she becomes a parent. Now, you can argue that that happens at conception or at various stages, but that idea of having three phases, we have it in many rituals, or we had it in the past. Many rituals around the world have it, and we have it in a lot of the language that we use. The stage that I want to bring your attention to is the margin phase, the liminal phase, which in the example I've just used is the phase of labour. And that liminal phase is often described as neither here nor there. You're neither in that group or this group. You're betwixt and between. It's a phase that's frequently likened to death, to invisibility, to darkness, or to being in the wilderness. And for all of those reasons, it's a chaotic time. You often hear people talking about the emotional roller coaster, and that's exactly what that marginal liminal time is all about. Now, many people have built on Van Gennep's theories, and I just want to draw your attention to two. So we've talked about the margin. I also want to draw your attention. I can't move on. I'm sorry. To what's called communitas. So Van Gennep came up with the phrase rites of passage, and then a man called Victor Turner talked about communitas. And what he looked at was the people who are going through that liminal phase. He noticed that amongst themselves, he called them threshold people. They tend to develop an intense comradeship where distinctions of rank and status disappear. and Turner calls it communitas. So it's a community of individuals or a communion of individuals. Some of you may have noticed that in our Living Well services when there's a bond between two patients who have never met perhaps before, but they're going through something together. Others might have noticed at a patient's bedside that the bond between the people around the bedside is particularly strong. Or, as the picture suggests, mourners at a vigil or funeral. I remember experiencing it myself at my aunt's bedside. I have a very successful cousin who I've never really got on with, but and we've hardly ever seen each other. But it was at her bedside. We, for about 20 minutes, I think, probably sat hand in hand and hugged each other afterwards. I've hardly spoken to him since, and I apparently tried to strangle him when I was little. So what I'm saying is we now had a particularly close relationship, but in that time, in that liminal space around her bedside, there was something that was unspoken, a bond between us. And that's what Victor Turner called communitas. And then the third one that I want to just talk a little bit about is that in rites of passage, I think there's something that I would call the ripple effect. In the example that I've given, the idea of a woman going through the rite of passage of motherhood, she's going through it, but actually the primary rite of passage is the baby being born. So you've got the baby being born as a rite of passage. You've got the woman giving birth, which rite of passage into motherhood. Especially for first-time parents, you'll also potentially have the partner going through their own rite of passage. If there are siblings, then they go through a rite of passage, particularly if they're becoming a brother or sister for the first time. And you may well have grandparents going through their own rite of passage, their own recognition that they've become the older generation, that they've become a granny or a grandpa, and all that that involves. And so the image that I've used is that of a ripple, that you've got the one rite of passage, the main one, but you've got lots of others going on at the same time. And if you go back to what I was describing of that liminal time, you've got a chaotic, emotionally charged, draining time. And that's why for years and years, we as human beings have put rituals around that liminal time, that liminal space. If you think about the opening of Parliament or the death of Queen Elizabeth, there's a huge amount of pomp and ceremony, and often I certainly sit back and wonder why we're doing all of that. But actually we do it so that we don't have a civil war. We do it so that we contain some of those emotions that are going on for people around that time. If you think for a moment, and I know it's a much bigger issue, but if you think about the US Capitol attack in 2021, that was an example of the rituals not being able to contain perhaps a particular personality, but certainly the strength of feeling and the sense of wanting to overthrow the rituals that usually guide us through. So just to recap what we've looked at so far, we've looked as a background at rites of passage. We've looked particularly at the liminal phase, that's betwixt and between. We've looked at communitas, which is something that Victor Turner talked about, that strong bond between individuals. And we've talked about the ripple effect, the fact that in a rite of passage, many other people can be affected in their own rite of passage, in their own chaos and their own emotional journey. So I want to think for a moment about what end-of-life rituals are for. I said earlier that Arnold van Gennep looked at lots of different rituals around those different around those different rites of passage. But for end of life, first of all, we're disposing of a body. But I would argue that we're doing more than that, and we need to do more than that. And part of it is marking a major life transition, and part of it is providing a structure. And it's the providing of the structure that I want to focus on. End-of-life rituals, to my mind, provide a structure for that liminal time, for that chaotic time. For communitas, if you think about the 2021 capital attack, but also potentially the riots that have happened in this country over the summer, there are lots and lots of different reasons for it. But that strong sense of coming together can be really powerful, like the example I gave of my cousin and I holding hands. But it also has the potential of being quite dangerous and incredibly volatile. And that's one of the things that rituals traditionally have tried to hold. So you've got liminality, communitas, the ripple effect, everybody's going through it together. I think end-of-life rituals also give a structure to our grief, a formal structure, a way in which we can publicly grieve, a dignified way of saying goodbye. If you think about any time that you have grieved for a person or for, well, we grieve for all sorts of reasons, then it's not a particularly pretty process. We grieve privately most of the time, and it's messy, it's ugly, it's painful. It's not something that you want to shout about. And a funeral, traditionally, the ritual around end of life has been a way of publicly marking something that we privately grieve. I think another thing that end of life rituals have traditionally provided is the opportunity to share stories and beliefs. In my view, a good funeral, you'll have the story of the person and potentially their story interweaved with other beliefs or their beliefs or the community's beliefs, the community's faith, for example. And that interweaving of stories, a meta-narrative with a personal narrative, helps with the idea of meaning and purpose in the midst of grief. So the sharing of stories, perhaps the sort of emphasis, re-emphasizing what's important, whether it be hope or whatever, a belief in the afterlife. The sharing of stories, I think, is an important part of that structure. And lastly, changing social dynamics. I mentioned before the death of the Queen and the fact that suddenly you've got Prince Charles becoming king and everybody moving up in the order or deciding not to be part of it. If you think about a more ordinary family, you've got people becoming the older generation, and potentially when particularly powerful figures die, you've got a jostling for position, and we often hear about it over wills and money and all of that kind of thing. But there's a lot going on, and changing social dynamics again. The idea of a ritual is to try to hold that change and help people to go through it until they've started to process that early grief. So what a traditional funeral is trying to do is to provide a structure. And I'm not advocating that we should stay with the old way. I'm just saying what some of those old ways were, or traditional ways. If you think about an undertaker and what an undertaker is trying to do, then I often think of them as stage managers or as guides, master of ceremonies. They're trying to herd people who can't really think for themselves at that time, or who are in a different premises, a premises that can hold a large number of people, and they're guiding people through. You've got the minister or the celebrant, who hopefully is enabling people to tell their story, the personal and the faith that I was talking about earlier. When I was first a minister in local church ministry, I felt it was my duty to pull the story of the deceased together, to tell it well, because at the time I first started in ministry, my feeling was that people weren't very good at doing that. And there was often a tendency for ministers to stick to Bible stories rather than the story of the person who had died. I was really keen that it should be the personal story, but actually after a while I realised that I was doing the mourners a disservice by pulling that story together myself, and that it was much better for them to try to start working together to put that story together from the different aspects of their family, partly because they'll hopefully come to a consensus around that. But also it's a part of the process of grieving. You tell the stories, you keep retelling them in order to try to come to terms with them. So the minister or the celebrant ideally is helping to tell the story. A lot of funerals nowadays you hear of people not wearing black, but actually the idea of wearing black in the first place was the idea of you can't express your grief very often. You can't express it in words. And so one way is to use symbolic action, and a symbolic action is to wear black, so that you don't have to say you're feeling low, you don't have to say what's inside, but you show it in what you're wearing. There's the carrying of the coffin, the idea that for the last mile, particularly in Ireland and in other more traditional cultures for a while, the men of the family would carry the coffin on their shoulder for the last mile before the burial ground. In the Highlands now, at a burial, the men of the family four of them would be asked to take the tape, which would mean that there would be 4 representatives of family lowering the body into the ground. Again, the idea of taking the physical weight of the grief of those who are there. And the throwing of earth onto the coffin, or the words ashes to ashes, dust to dust. It's that, again, an expression of beliefs, a retelling of stories, that idea of returning to the earth from which all living things come. So I'm not saying that traditional funerals are perfect. Many of us have had bad experiences of them, but some of those traditions had reasons, had meanings behind them, and I think it's important for us to recognise that. Next, I want to briefly explore how end-of-life rituals have changed over time. But before I do that, I want to run through a brief history. Before I do the history, I want to just touch on different faiths and cultures. Right. Okay. Right. Obviously, the people we care for come from different traditions and different cultures. And many of you who will have been at Phyllis Tuckwell for a long time, or those who have worked in other healthcare settings, may be familiar with a grid where you've got a list of different religions and the different parts of the belief system. So what their sacred text is, what their faith leaders are called, and end-of-life rituals. And over the time I've been here, I've tried gently to steer us away from that, partly because I think that most of the time we have time to ask questions that perhaps in a hospital context people don't. And I think it's really important that we have that time to ask questions, because as new generations are born, second, third generation of a particular culture and a different faith are in this country, you may well be dealing with 1, 2, 3 generations, and all of those different generations will have a different attachment to their native country, or the native country of the oldest generation. They will have different affiliations to the religion. And in my experience, it's much better that we ask open, respectful questions rather than jump to conclusions that a Buddhist thinks this and believes that, or a Jew thinks this and thinks that. It depends on the culture, it depends on the country of origin, it depends on the generation. And I've never met anyone so far who has been offended by an open, respectful question. I've only come across people who are offended when we've assumed that if they're Buddhist, this is what they think. So yeah, by all means, send a referral to chaplaincy, and we will try to support you if it's difficult for you to ask questions. But I would tend to veer away from that chart. So I've mentioned that we have a wide variety of people from different cultures and religions in our care, and I don't want to make any suggestion that everyone has the same tradition or custom. But what I do want to do is just think for a moment about when you think of a traditional Western funeral or a traditional English funeral, I want us to just look at how that's changed over time, because it hasn't always stayed the same. In the UK, funeral practices can be traced back to pagan times, and one of the pictures, the top one, is of a burial mound, and in those times, pagan times, the focus was on the afterlife. So relatives and the community would gather together items that would be offerings for the deceased to get into the afterlife, as it were. So a very, very different tradition in this country to what we have now. And then there was the arrival of Christianity in the UK during Roman and Anglo-Saxon times, and that was when the church started to play a much more central role in funeral processes, with prayers, readings and sermons. And the funeral, as we see it now, owes a lot of its identity to the Victorian era. Queen Victoria, in her mourning of Albert, there was a lot of wearing black was already traditional, but it became a bigger thing, as did processions. And then more recent influences that have changed funeral or end-of-life rituals. There's been the impact of the world wars. There's been Princess Diana's funeral, which many people talk about a sort of move to a much more personal experience, or a more personal funeral. More recently than that, we've had COVID, with so many changes that I think we're only just perhaps beginning to recognise. There's the cost of living, which I've already said, I think owes quite a lot to why we're seeing a rise in direct cremations. And there's environmental concerns, the idea of green funerals and country woodland burial sites, the idea of doing things differently for the environment. So there are all sorts of different factors coming in and changing our rituals over time. I want to move on to the next slide. So if I go back to the question, what are end-of-life rituals for? Direct cremations clearly deals with the disposal of the body, but I suppose the argument I'm trying to make is that funerals, the traditional funeral, is trying to do much more than that and needs to do much more of that than that we're marking a major life transition and we're providing a structure. And so just disposing of the body doesn't do enough. And it does it at an emotionally draining time. What I want to do just for a moment is read a description that I think sums it up very well. It was Michelle Obama in her book Becoming, which is her description of her early life and meeting Barack Obama. She describes the death of her father, and in doing so, I think describes grief very well and what can happen in that emotional roller coaster that I've been describing. She writes, "It hurts to live after someone has died. It just does. It can hurt to walk down a hallway or open the fridge. It hurts to put on a pair of socks, to brush your teeth. Food tastes like nothing. Colours go flat. Music hurts, and so do memories. You look at something you would otherwise find beautiful, a purple sky at sunset or a playground full of kids, and it only somehow deepens the loss. Grief is so lonely that way." The day after my father died, we drove down to Southside funeral parlour, me, my mother and Craig, her brother, to pick out a casket and to plan a service, to make arrangements, as they say in the funeral parlours. I don't remember much about our visit there, except for how stunned we were. Each of us bricked inside our private grief. Still, as we went through the obscene ritual of shopping for the right box in which to bury our dad, Craig and I managed to have our first and only fight as adult siblings. It boiled down to this. I wanted to buy the fanciest, most expensive casket in the place, complete with every extra handle and cushion a casket could possibly have. I had no particular rationale for wanting this. It was something to do when there was nothing else to do. The practical, pragmatic part of our upbringing wouldn't allow me to put much stock in the gentle, well-intentioned platitudes people would heap on us a few days later at the funeral. I couldn't be easily comforted by the suggestion that my dad had gone to a better place or was sitting with the angels. As I saw it, he just deserved a nice casket. Craig, meanwhile, insisted that Dad would want something basic, modest and practical, and nothing more. It suited our father's personality, he said. Anything else would be too showy. We started quiet, but soon exploded as the kindly funeral director pretended not to listen, and our mother just stared at us through the fog of her own pain. We were yelling for reasons that were nothing to do with the actual argument. Neither of us were invested in the outcome. In the end, we'd bury our dad in a compromise casket, nothing too fancy, nothing too plain, and never once discuss it again. We were having an absurd and inappropriate argument because, in the wake of death, every single thing on earth feels absurd and inappropriate. I think while I've tried to stick to the facts, I think for me that story sums it up. Someone who we know of as an articulate, intelligent person who just in the midst of grief, it came out in an argument. So what I think I've tried to suggest is that end-of-life rituals are so much more than disposing of a body. And in terms of my personal reflections on why I thought it was important to share it with you today, is that in advanced care planning, I think we need to perhaps try and encourage people to talk about things like this sooner rather than later and ask questions about the service that they're getting. It's become very clear to me in just looking into this that a lot of people, including funeral directors, offer direct cremations, but will offer different amounts of service. So if you go back to that earlier story I told you about the fact that the family would no longer have access to the body after it left our care, that isn't true of all direct cremation services. And for some that will be important, for others it won't be. What I think is important is to recognise that sometimes people change their mind in the midst of grief. And if a body has gone to direct cremation service that doesn't offer the opportunity to view a body, then it's too late. So I know it's difficult and I know you've got 100 other things to do, but in advanced care planning situations, there's a lot of information out there, but a lot of the information that's out there is provided by people who are selling their wares. And we perhaps are one of the interventions that we're not trying to sell anything, we're just trying to support the people who are in our care. And I think it comes up for counselling. If somebody, we're hearing it already with people who lost loved ones during COVID, the idea that people weren't able to go to an event, a funeral, an end-of-life ritual, so that either it doesn't feel real, or I was talking to someone recently who described the fact that because the funeral was done online, they had no idea who attended. And so it's years later that they're beginning to realise, because they're bumping into other people who would have attended a funeral, who say, oh, it was beautiful, or oh, we really wanted to be there. They had no idea because they were doing it on their own, with 7 or 8 people in a room, knowing that people were watching, but it's not quite the same as walking into a room full of people who are all there for the same reason. So I think in counselling, it might be appropriate at times to suggest creating a symbolic action or a ritual. Rituals don't have to be huge. A symbolic action could be as simple as wearing black, but something to help people to process what they've gone through, what they're going through, can sometimes be helpful. Yeah, so just to go back to the map, we've talked about rites of passage, or I've talked about rites of passage theories. We've explored what end-of-life rituals are for, or my suggestion of what they're for. We've touched on the fact that there are other faiths and cultures that we cater for with our patients and our relatives, and that my suggestion would be that we don't assume, we ask open, respectful questions, and ask chaplaincy for support if you're struggling. That our end-of-life rituals have changed over time. They haven't stayed the same. We haven't always worn black, and we haven't always done church services. A personal reflection that, to my mind, direct cremations are here to stay. That's not, in my view, going to change. But we might just need to think a little bit more about how we support people in their conversations. I said at the beginning how often I hear that idea that I'm trying to make it easier for my family. And I wonder whether that is always the case. You might think that that's what you're doing, but given the liminal characteristics that I've described, perhaps you're not, if it's just about disposing of the body. So I've talked about advanced care planning and counselling, and yeah, I think now it's time for your comments, for your questions, and for your stories. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jill, for that. I wonder if you could stop sharing screen so then we can sort of see each other. And can I just make sure everyone's put their name in the chat that joined us? And yeah, so has anybody got any comments for Jill or any experience of the direct cremations? Anybody from the ward or hospice care at home? No? People are just popping their names in.
Just to say thank you, Jill, for a presentation with a difference. I'm often reading about drugs, but it's nice to think about these wider aspects into bereavement for the family. So thank you.
Yeah.
It's Therese speaking. I've got something that I just wanted to say. And Jill's quite right with the knock-on effect of what happened during COVID, particularly in the situations now that some of us within counselling are finding, and it relates as well to direct cremations because that was happening a lot during that time. And I recall a lady that told me about her husband that had was being cremated. She had no idea even what crematorium he was being taken to because it was within a 50-mile radius was all she was told. She had no idea of the time that the cremation took place, so she couldn't even sit at home and reflect with maybe a candle lit or sitting quietly. And the knock-on effect from that was about a year later that she had come to us and was still distressed, upset. She couldn't go back. She couldn't change any of that. I wrote an article for The Nest a couple of years ago about the sort of pandemic of grief, which is around a similar subject, really, that that lack of being able, at the time you think you were doing the right thing or it's the best thing to do, but it's the knock-on effect of people's thoughts and grieving still after the effect, really.
And I hadn't heard of direct cremations really until this. Obviously, they might have heard about them more on the ward. I wonder if it's something that more and more people are seeing, particularly when patients are planning it, and if they really understand all the consequences, as you were saying, Jill, for the grievers. I've got a couple of hands up now. I think the first one was Sarah Bailey next to me.
Yeah. Hi, thanks, Phil. That was really interesting. And I think you've raised a very important point about funeral plans being potentially part of our ACP. I may be the only person who doesn't go into it in detail with patients, but I don't. I might note that they've made a funeral plan, but not necessarily what that was. And I think you're right that people don't always think about the implications of their decisions on their family members. They don't think about other people's perceptions and what they need. And maybe just opening up the conversation is a way to think that through. I mean, when my mum died, and then a few weeks later my grandma died, and my dad wanted to do a rerun of the same funeral because it was easy. Me and my sisters were like, no, we can't just relive the same thing a few weeks later. We've got to do it a different place and differently. And that was, my dad was fine once we said that, but if we hadn't had the guts to step up and go, no, we can't do this. And that was just the way he thought about things. It's practical, it's logical, it doesn't require, and I guess that's the same with our patients and some of them about their perception of what's okay for their family without actually asking them.
And there's a hand up from Kate, or I think there's a whole lot of you there at King's Lodge. I don't know who
there's
who
three
it
of
is.
us here. It's me butting in again. It's in response to what you said that you've not come across direct cremations. I bet you have. The big company that's selling to our patients and their relatives is Pure Cremations, and they're a direct company.
Right.
They have a beautiful, tranquil, glossy-looking website with white and lilies everywhere, but it is basic cremation.
But I take it people can still choose to have a memorial of their own choosing without any of the bodily remains, and I wonder if people are doing that instead.
And all I would say, if you go back to trying to think about that in the midst of grief, like Sarah was saying earlier about it was just easier and to do what they'd done a few weeks before is the most obvious. Or, for example, some beautiful examples and a lot on these websites about we went up a mountain or we did this, that and the other. They're stunning and they're very personal. But is it accessible to everybody who's grieving? And yeah, I think all of those things are possible. It's just about thinking it through and thinking it through, not in the midst of grief.
Yeah. And Christine, I think you were next with your hand up.
Yeah, it was just sort of two things really, just sort of a couple of statements really. The first one is funerals are for the living. And then the other was everything we do impacts on people, and our deaths should too. It should not be nondescript. It should be about us having our fingerprints on it.
Very good, thank you, Christine. And then Lisa, you've got a hand up.
Yes, that was very well said, Christine. I've experienced probably about 4 or 5 people dying in the last 18 months, 2 of which did have direct cremations, and the family found that quite difficult. Somebody else that just had very immediate family for the cremation and had other people at a memorial service. So that was a slight change again. And then another one which hasn't been mentioned is about people wanting to donate their body to science as well, because with that there's just a memorial service, and that's another thing that one of my friends, both parents have done. So it is interesting. You've got the person themselves and their wishes, but the impact on the family around them. So I just thought I'd throw that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I see we've only got a few more minutes to go. Is there anybody else that wants to make any more comments? If not, then I'm going to thank Jill for that really sort of thought-provoking, interesting talk, which a lot of us have both professional and personal experiences of. So that was great, thank you. People, please, can you complete the evaluation form? There should be a copy in emails, and I apologise for there seemed to be some issue with the emails and people getting the link, but I have put it in the chat box. I will make sure that I'll have a look at the last email that was circulated, that the link was in there. It's really helpful for people to have. And then I'm going to stop recording. So thank you, Jill. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
There's lots of thanks coming in the chat, Jill, as well, that you might want to see.
Thank you.